everybody to our fourth and final webinar. Mary Jane, our Conservation Director, will be interviewing Terry Antoniuk, a conservation easement holder. And it's going to be a pretty free flow. If you have questions, put your hand up or put something in the chat. And maybe I know Terry's going to tell a bit of a pass on some information first, and if something's burning, feel free to interrupt, but we will be happy if you want to unmute yourself and speak. If that's easier than typing, feel free to join in. We'll do a little bit more of a loose agenda here. We'll kind of go with the flow. So it's being recorded, as we've said before, and I will be sending out the recording and the evaluation form. We contemplated saying you had to fill out the evaluation form before you could get the recording, but that might be a little onerous. So look forward to that at the end of this week or early Monday morning. So anyways, there you go, Terry and Mary Jane. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Carrie. So I do have a list of questions that have come in, but like Carrie said, please feel free if questions pop up as we're having our conversation. Please feel free to jump in and ask. Terry said he's more than happy to take questions from the participants as we go, so you don't have to wait till the end of the session. So we'll go, we'll go through the questions that I have on the list. As long as we can, and like I said, questions can pop up at any time, and then we'll make sure we leave some time at the end if you have questions that you think of that you want to ask at the end. So again, we want to have as much interaction as you all want. So yes, please feel free to jump in, unmute yourself and jump in, or to send something in the chat, and Carrie is going to keep an eye on that and let us know if something comes in that we don't see. Okay. So we'll get started with the big one, Terry. Why did you decide to put a conservation easement on your property?
Okay, well, it's not a simple answer, probably like the rest of you. We all have our own ideas, and there's something that's unique about our property and our families, all of the above. I guess a little bit about myself. I'm now mainly retired. I'm a biologist, and worked a lot across Canada. So I've been exposed to a lot of different things, and that actually factored into my decision. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the conservation easement was placed on a property that I did not live on. Nobody in my family lived on. And there's a reason for that. My dad grew up on a farm east of Edmonton in the parkland. So a little bit similar to the property that's about seven miles northwest of Olds. It's right at the north end of the Mountain View County. And it's the Little Red Deer River goes through the northwest corner of the 240 acres that my parents bought. And they bought that as a retirement place. They were ended up living outside of Canada for most of my father's career. So this was kind of a link back to Canada, link back to the place that he grew up in. And the other thing that he was really fortunate about is when they got the property, they set up an arrangement with a neighbor, Don Grant, to farm it. And so Don farmed it for over 30 years until he retired and kind of focused on cattle operations rather than crops. So it was the kind of thing that was in the family. It was there. Don did a fabulous job managing it, and we could just go visit it when we were back here. As I mentioned, because my folks were living overseas and we were living overseas, it became clear that that my parents were not going to retire on the property, which was the original plan. And at that time, they decided that they wanted to pass it on, and I was the only one living in this part of the world. I also had a real connection to the land because, although I didn't live there, I'm a hunter, and I spent many years hunting on that property and that of neighbors. So I had a connection to the land, and also because I'm a biologist, I really enjoyed getting out there and seeing it, walking around on it. So, kind of as an early inheritance in my parents gifted Claudette and I, my wife and I, the land. And my dad and I had talked quite a bit about what he wanted, his vision for the land, basically. And because it wasn't a primary source of income for him, and because it really meant something to him, because it was connected to, it was right on the banks of the Little Red Deer River, and I forgot to mention it had 60 of the 240 acres parcel that they originally bought, my parents originally bought. There was 80 acres that was solely cropland, and then the quarter, 60 acres of that roughly, was mature mixed wood forest that had never been disturbed, and that was connected to the Little Red Deer River. So in terms of conservation values, biodiversity, it was a pretty neat piece of property, and frankly, my dad had wanted to see that protected, and that made a lot of sense to me. So there was, I guess, an informal agreement when he passed the land on that we would protect those values. And one of the first tests came, I don't know, this is probably 25 years ago. Some of the mills in British Columbia were running short of lumber. And I don't know how many of you experienced this, but there was contractors coming around to this part of the world looking to harvest timber. And there's a lot of spruce on this property. It would have generated a lot of income if we cleared it. It also would have provided, more agricultural land, because the land, I guess there's roughly 90 acres, that's cultivated. There's also an old homestead that had a barn on it and a house. So again, because of the agreement with my father, it was pretty easy to turn down the income. Well, it wasn't easy to turn down the income, but that was the appropriate decision to say, no, these are the values that need to be protected. This mature forest and the riparian habitat, the vegetation that kind of protects the riverbanks along the Little Red Deer River. I guess then moving forward, as I said, through my work working on environmental issues across Canada and just hunting in this region, it became clear that those pieces of forest and the riverbanks on the Little Red, the Red Deer, Dog Pound, and others were being impacted by all of our activities, by residential development, by changes in farming practices, by more intensive farming practices, increasing the number of cattle grazing on land, clearing land, cattle grazing within forests, and that all makes total sense. But the inevitable outcome of that was just a yearly loss of these pieces of forest and undisturbed vegetation. So a new neighbor appeared on the scene at this time and bought land bordering this property to the west. His name was Jim Smith. and one of the founders of Legacy Land Trust, active in the land trust community for quite a while. And because of my biological background, because of the work that I did, Jim and I had lots of discussions about how neat it would be to try to protect joined pieces of or joined properties along the Little Red Deer River, because some of the properties, quite frankly, upstream had been abused. Water quality in the Little Red Deer River was deteriorating, and one way to do this is just to protect properties or the conservation values of those properties. So that again made sense given the marching orders from my father, and but I didn't really have any idea how I was going to do it other than at some point I was going to do it. One day I got a call from Jim, and it's telling me that Legacy Land Trust had been formed, and asking if I was willing to put in an application to the Alberta Land Trust grant program to put a conservation easement on this property. And I'm embarrassed to say I said yes without really understanding what it meant. And that's because I guess the goal of protecting the conservation values of this property was really clear. It's something that we were going to do, that the family supported doing, but the specifics I'd never really worried about. And it was something that I put off into the future. I was really busy working at that time. So I said, yeah, the easiest thing was to say yes. And then I was shocked with the next year, the application for funding had been approved. And that meant that this kind of concept that we'd had for 20 or 30 years was now real, and we actually had to, I had to do something about it, and Legacy had to do something about it. I came to understand that not only in terms of protecting land, but there were some tax benefits of making or registering a conservation easement. And so then I started, because at that time I was thinking about retirement. So I decided that I needed to make a large capital or trigger a large capital gain, and that the ideal way to do that would be to do that at the same time, or to use the value of the conservation easement to offset that. The date of the capital gain was set, so that meant I had to work back and actually registered the conservation easement prior to that for tax purposes. So what that meant for me was a real scramble in terms of getting all the work done, providing the information that Legacy and others needed to define and the conservation easement terms and conditions. And I'm glad to say that it generally worked out really well in the end. It was a very positive process, but I hope that nobody else on this call is like me. That I hope that you take the time to think through things. It all worked out for us, but that's kind of the looking back. I did not appreciate how long it was going to take to get through the process. I didn't appreciate how much thinking I was going to need to do, and thinking is tough for me. It's not going to be that way for you, but there's a lot of things to think about. And so really positive process, but yeah, there were certainly some wrinkles along the way, many of which were my doing, and others that weren't. So I guess that's kind of the shortish long version of why a conservation easement. It was a whole bunch of factors. The objective, I think, was really clear all along the way, but the way it was going to be done and the specifics, I really hadn't thought through before embarking on the process.
Great. That's really neat. That's That's I suspect that your story will resonate with several other people as well. So we'll just start diving into some of the questions, and they might some of them might have been answered already, but some of them might generate a little bit of a side discussion. So we'll just go through the list. Did you know anyone else who was thinking about a CE or had a CE being conservation easement, or had already put one on?
So I guess I knew, yes, I knew generally about the concept of conservation easements through my work, because I was a landscape ecologist, which meant that I did like watershed planning or regional land use planning. And through that, we talked about the value of some of the tools, and conservation easements were one of the tools that I think just have huge value, both for landowners and for conservation purposes. So generally, I was aware of it. I was also aware of work that other organizations, Nature Conservancy being the big one, had done to protect I guess the ones I was most aware of were fairly large tracts of lands, like large ranches, etc., and across North America. And then, of course, kind of drilling down a little bit, neighbor Jim Smith had more specifics because he'd been volunteering and working in this area specifically for probably 10 or 15 years. And he was negotiating, he put in an application to the Alberta Land Trust Grant Program at the same time as our quarter. And it was approved at the same time. So we were kind of both working through it together and talked as neighbors about whether there was things that we could do that would add value or perhaps prevent problems for the neighbor. So yes, aware generally and specifically. I found I did take the one-day course, or the one-day seminar, basically that the Legacy Land Trust put on as I was working through it, and I found that really helpful because there was, although I thought I understood it, there was a lot more details that I didn't understand.
Yeah, great. So what surprises came up in the process? Good, bad, otherwise.
Well, we don't have that long.
If you can keep it, yeah.
So I'll talk about the biggest surprise, and I think that there was surprises in terms of the details to think about, and the details to think about is ideally placing a conservation easement is in perpetuity. I know that's what it's intended to be, and I think that's what it is. But thinking through the implications of perpetuity was challenging for me. I think of myself as somebody who thinks long term, but long term versus perpetuity is different. So that was one of the challenges of thinking, okay, really, what are the terms and conditions that achieve our goals, and try to, and in spite of things that we can't anticipate right now that are going to occur. And so folks at Legacy were really valuable in that. But that was I guess a surprise, is having to think in a slightly different way. And then something really specific to this property is this property qualified for eco-gift. And so there's some real financial tax benefits of having an eco-gift approval. But what that means is that Environment Canada has to sign off fundamentally that the property provides substantial conservation values, I guess is the way that I would describe it. And so they have to come out and look at the property, and they have criteria that they look at. And their criteria, I think, are pretty arbitrary. And I think that it totally depends on who's looking at things. And I guess at the end of the day, they said, yes, this property, from my perspective as a biologist, this property had real value because of the comparatively large area, 60 acres of forest directly connected to a river valley in an area where that was very limited. There wasn't a ton of that around, and it had been undisturbed. But the Environment Canada representative said, well, you know what? In order to qualify for eco-gift status, you need to take a piece of the cultivated area and let that revert to natural. And you need to do this, and you need to do that. And basically they dictated what in their view would be required for it to be eco-gift. And that's their prerogative. I fundamentally didn't think there was a sound technical basis for what they were saying. But as I alluded to earlier, I was under a time crunch, and I had a decision about whether to get this done or not. And so I guess, frankly, I accepted the direction from Environment Canada that if I'd had more time, I probably would have fought a lot harder, as I said, because I didn't think it had a technical basis. Then one of the steps is that get an independent evaluation of the property in terms of how much it's worth, which provides the tax receipt. And for the first time ever, as I understand it, the Environment Canada did not accept the independent appraisal. So basically what they said to me is, you have to set this chunk of land aside that's currently being farmed, that's providing me and my family income, and turn it into, let it recover to natural. But we're not going to give you any benefit of that because we don't think it's worth anything. So again, that's something that I would have fought but couldn't because I was in a time crunch. So huge surprise to both me and I think to Legacy Land Trust. And that I guess frankly made what to me should have been a very, very happy decision to do this for the benefit of I guess the family vision and also conservation. And it left a real distaste in my mouth as I was signing the conservation easement. A lot of that, as I said, was my fault because I didn't get on this early enough. Yeah, that was a huge surprise and not a pleasant one.
Thanks, Terry. And I just want to say that I and I know Legacy in general really appreciate your honesty and candor in that, and that we would like to say it's always sunshine and rainbows, but it isn't. But that doesn't mean that in general the whole thing is terrible. But there's little bits and pieces that happen and that you don't expect and maybe don't agree with. So we really appreciate that you feel comfortable to tell us exactly how it went for you. I'm going to jump a little bit in the questions just to try to cover
Mary
some
Jane,
things. Yes.
Fred has a question that might be good to answer now. Do you want me to read it or do you want to look at it? If this was not an ecological gift, would you still do the deal and pay the tax?
Great question.
Terry?
Yes, that was the decision I had to make fundamentally at the end of the day, is that even if it hadn't been classified as an eco gift, there would have been a a tax, some real substantial tax benefits in doing it. It just that with EcoGift, the tax benefits were much larger and could extend over a larger period of time. And so that was kind of, that's what I was weighing. Should I let the federal government in to help tell me what to do, and get a larger tax receipt, basically, which was helpful to me. The advice that the accountant gave it was, hold your nose and get the benefit. That's a decision that you have to make. Mm-hmm. I was prepared to go ahead with a smaller tax benefit. Quite frankly, I probably would have gone ahead without, but there was some real, it just made a ton of sense to maximize the tax benefit given the circumstances at that time. And so that was the trade-off. It was the right decision. It was the right decision to make. And I keep trying to tell myself that. So anyway, that's just stuff to factor in, to really understand. I think that you've heard from the lawyers and the accountants, and that was my stupidity. I just didn't pay enough attention to all that stuff going in and think it through well enough before long enough before the deadline.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that every property is different, and that's why we recommend that you talk to your own accountant and lawyer and decide what's best for you, because it may be more beneficial for one and not for the next. Thanks, Fred. Do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I want to add to that. I think that's a very important discussion, because that's the tipping point where people decide if they're going to do the deal or not. And we have that challenge in my own practice. And I think the rules have to be somewhat modified or changed, because you're going to lose a lot of land that won't go into conservation because someone in the family decides that they deserve some sort of tax relief. And so it's an issue. And I don't know, from what you said, Terry, if the people who are determining if it's an eco gift or not are qualified. So it's a problem.
And a question that came in too is, has Environment Canada's attitude changed lately? That's something that I don't know personally. Terry, do you have any inclination?
I'll provide my perspective, and then I'd appreciate Kim and Mary Jane jumping in. In my work, I worked a lot with the federal government, with Environment Canada and organizations, and my expectation is this will continue to be arbitrary. It will continue to be based on individual decisions, and that's both good and bad, quite frankly, because it's based on individual decisions. If you take the time to talk to the assessor about it, then I think you have a chance of, perhaps broadening the discussion around the guidelines that are down on paper. So that works both ways. But in a rush, like the way that it evolved for us, that option just wasn't there. I feel like with my technical background, I could have, if I'd had more time, my fault again, to provide input, I could have perhaps made a better story and talk through stuff. So at the end of the day, Fred, the rules are the rules, and all we can do is try to do the best in each situation. And then, okay, here's the facts, just exactly like I had until the end of 2018 to make a decision. And in November, when things came together, I had to decide, my wife and I had to decide how it was going to go. So we that's what we chose.
I think Kim has something to add, and then I think Bob has a question.
Yeah, Bob has a question.
So I'll let Kim go, and then we'll take Bob's question.
Okay, so I think, thank you. I think with the, there's a few things that happened in Terry's situation. So one was the eco-gift certification aspect of it, and it was deemed as sensitive as Terry has indicated, with the qualification that that one piece be allowed to naturalize. And and there is some subjectivity to that, and there also is some subjectivity in the overall application of the eco-gift certification. But I will qualify it with it's very general because it does cover the entire country. And so Terry's points are well taken that there's value in having that subjectivity and ability to have conversation with the certifier. It has evolved over time, and personally I think it's gotten better, because initially there was kind of literally 3 points in when did we start with EcoGift? 2000 and early 2000s, I can't remember the exact year, but there was literally 3 points, and so it was quite that. I do think they're doing a lot of internal work on this. The person who came out to Terry's property, we've had quite a few conversations with about how to accommodate some of this agro-environmental crossroads. And I, as far as I'm aware, there are no answers, but I do think they are making some effort in that direction. So hopefully as time goes on, experiences like Terry's get brought into the internal discussions that they're having, and we'll come out the other side with some better clarity for landowners. I think as land trusts, because we see a few of these, we kind of get a bit of a better picture, but for a landowner, it's one touch point. And so I think hopefully it shall get better. The second point about the valuation side is that was done by the appraisal review panel. So once the Environment Canada staff certify it, then it goes into the appraisal review panel. And frankly, that was a terrible experience for both Terry and us as a land trust. And because we were basically asked to resubmit an appraisal that had no, it didn't follow the process, and it seems to be a bit of a black box. So one of the points on my to-do list over the next number of months is to re-engage into that appraisal process and see if we can get a clearer picture. So that speaks to Fred's point about, do people, you know, are they technically aware? Yes, they are. They're certified appraisers, so they definitely are. But the way appraisals get looked at can vary. So there were some, Terry's is the weirdest eco-gift case I've seen since I started doing anything with eco-gifts in like 20 plus years. And I hope we don't have another one. It was very stressful. I mean, I know for them, they had tight decisions to make, but so did we as a land trust, so it was challenging. But so it was unfortunate. I think it was great that how Terry handled it, because it was challenging. But again, most are not that way, but we kind of picked Terry for a reason, because people need to know that there are hiccups on or asked Terry, we didn't pick him, he said yes. But anyway, so that's all I'll add to that right now.
Great, thank you. Bob, you go ahead with your question.
Sure, just a few questions that come up. I wondered, when you apply for a conservation easement, are neighbors consulted, or can neighbors oppose that process, or do they have any input into that? That's my first question.
Okay, I guess it's my understanding it's my land. I get to do with it what I want. So there's no formal requirement for input, Bob, that I'm aware of. Having said that, I mean, as a good neighbor, talking to neighbors, like we talk to the folks that have been farming the land on our behalf, just to make sure it wasn't gonna interfere with their operations. So that that was another thing that's perhaps unique about our property, because a third party had been managing it, probably way more effectively than I would have. That talked to them, and in this case, the only other neighbor was Jim Smith, and we were talking quite a bit about it.
In the evaluation process, I guess in Kim's experience and others, how close does that come to? So the land value is X if it were sold for whatever. Then there's the land value that affects your tax credit. How close are those evaluations usually? I mean, is it 50%, 75%? What would that usually be?
Yeah, there's not really a normal, Bob. It really does depend on the level of restrictions. So the more restricted the property is, the more requirements. So if we remember back a couple ones, we talked about how easements can be both positive and negative in nature. So the more that the landowner cannot do or is required to do, the bigger that differentiation between the current fair market value and the after the CE is put in place. We have seen easements of like over 50%. We've seen easements as low as 20% value. Probably the norm is 25 to 30. But again, it's highly variable. I generally don't even say that there, it's probably 25 to 30 because it's so differentiated based on so many circumstances.
Right. I guess that too, that I don't quite understand. So once an environmental easement or conservation easement or eco gift is put on, and the people that did that, the owners who did that, is that land then able to be sold, even keeping the environmental easement on it by the estate or kids or whatever?
Yeah. So because it's registered on title through the conservation easement legislation, that legislation ensures that the easement will carry forward regardless of land ownership. So as soon as it's on title, then any future landowner is bound by that, those requirements. Now the impact on value to that property, like the sale value or the transfer value over time, the nearer the date you are to putting the conservation easement on, the closer it will be to the value in those appraisals, the further out you get in time. So if the property sells or transfers 15 years later, it's likely to be of lower value than property around it that does not have an easement, but it can also grow quite, like it narrows the gap generally over time just because land's a limited resource.
Oh, great.
Does that make
thank
sense?
you.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and these have been great 4 sessions that we've had. And Terry, that was great. Hearing the goods and the bads and the uglies and so on. So that's been great. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, sorry, just a specific example from our property, because this may be something that everybody else is wrestling with. Although there was a farmyard, an old farmyard on the property, and my wife and I had talked about whether we wanted to move out there, and we thought we were going to at one point, and then changed our mind. And so when we were initially contemplating the conservation easement, didn't see the need to maintain the option of subdividing for a residence. When, through discussions with folks from Legacy, they said, that's something you really should consider. Again, you're doing this in perpetuity. That's the kind of change in thinking that I referenced earlier. And maybe somebody's going to want to do that at some point. Like at this point, our daughter and her fiance would inherit the property. So maybe they would want to build. And, so it's a trade. Should that option be foreclosed? Well, the difference between including the opportunity, not preventing the opportunity of subdividing for a farm versus allowing that, as I understand it, Bob, had a real difference in terms of the valuation of the property, because that was a real tangible thing that the appraisers could say, well, we know if you'd said no subdivision, that really reduces the value of the property in this part of the world, because so many, there's been 5-acre, 10-acre parcels. I can't remember what's allowed. So anyway, that's kind of you make the one decision and it has all these implications to think through, which is, it's good that it's pointed out, but yeah. that was a specific for us.
Right.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Those are great questions. Alexandra, I see you have your hand up. Now, this is great because Alexandra is from the EcoGift program, so I'm guessing she's going to give us a little bit of feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Jane. Terry, I do appreciate your comments actually about the EcoGifts process, because obviously if we don't hear about these things, we can't, change or improve on certain things where it's needed, right? So I do appreciate those comments. And, as Kim mentioned, yes, we use the national criteria for looking at ecological sensitivity, and they do look, very arbitrary and very general. But again, because it's national criteria, we have to kind of consider regional flexibility as well. And so what I've personally done is just try to kind of specify those national criteria to kind of more specific, like regional criteria as well, like how it would kind of apply. But it is still sort of based on a case-by-case basis, and definitely I would encourage, any landowners who are interested in going through the EcoGifts process to engage with the land trust and with EcoGifts very early on to make sure that any sort of more so even just like land use ideas that you want with the property are spoken about in advance, just to make sure that it is going to be something that will qualify for the program, so that we avoid it kind of, later on down the road that actually it turns out, even after the appraisal report is done, that it won't qualify for EcoGifts. So we do look at not only just sort of the overall sensitivity of the habitat and whatnot, but also what are the typical plans for that property. So is there going to be agricultural use of it, or selective logging, or just examples like that. And I'm hope that for the most part, we have improved on that. And I'm certainly learning. I've been in this position for about 1.5 years and learning about sort of the legacy EcoGift process, and hoping that we're sort of improving on being a little bit more consistent with sort of our rationale. But being that it is still on a case-by-case basis, so we do try to work with the landowners and explain why maybe something may or may not be qualified for EcoGift, and if not, maybe how to improve that. So, but yes, certainly I can appreciate your comments there, Terry. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. We have one other question that we'll take with regards to EcoGift. Obviously, this is a hot topic, and I think then we'll kind of cut it off for EcoGift, and that might be something that we can gather in the evaluations. It might be worthwhile doing a session specifically to EcoGift, because there seems to be a lot of questions with regards to that. But I think because we have just not too much time left, we'll move on to some other questions that have come up. But just one question, and how many of Legacy's conservation easements have achieved EcoGift status? And Kim, can you confirm that? Is it all of them that we have so far? Oh, she's not here.
You can get the answer and see.
It is nearly all, but I can get that answer. So yeah, we do go through that process with most of our properties. And yeah, as we learn and as we grow, we realize, we know that we need to work with the EcoGift program earlier on, so it's not a surprise right at the end of the time frame. And so we're all learning and hopefully making that experience a little bit more positive for other landowners, and so that Terry was our guinea pig in that process, I guess, and we don't want everybody to have the same experience as Terry did with that. But again, it's good to know that there are hiccups, and then we learn from those, right? There's another question that popped up in the chat here. It says, are there any protocols on sharing future carbon credits? Are these being negotiated in today's agreements? That's a good question. Kim, are you on now again? Yeah,
Yeah, sorry. There was people coming to pick up Paint the Barn Red book, so I had to tune out for
no
a minute.
worries.
Yeah, so carbon credits is a really interesting topic, and there's a whole bunch happening on that front. It's probably better if somebody has specific things to call me directly at. So I'll give you my cell phone. It's 403-807-3237. But very quickly, what it will depend on is the way that the carbon credit program is set up. So all of Legacy's conservation easements from day one have been written to recognize that if ecosystem goods and services or offset programs come up, that the landowner would retain the right to participate in those. So the short answer is, as far as we're concerned, if there's a carbon offset program or any other biodiversity stewardship credits, any other sort of payment for ecosystem services program, the landowner could participate. The qualification is, and Legacy is actually a partner in a current carbon offset protocol consideration. And the reason we're doing that is to understand how conservation easements and landowners can fit into that. So very much it depends on the way the front end of the protocol or the program is designed, because a lot of them have start dates. And so that's a really bad answer, but it's about the best I can give without sort of specific. So if anybody has something specific, please give me a call.
Great, thanks, Kim. Just checking the chat. Okay, so let's jump to something different. What were your financial costs? Like, did you have to put any of your own money into this project, Terry?
No, the way that it worked out, it was covered off by the Alberta Land Trust grant program. And again, because I entered in so naively, I didn't even understand what the costs were, but they were all covered. So that may not be representative, but that's certainly the way it evolved in our case.
Great, yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit. We tried to get funding for every program, but it doesn't always work out that we can. So where we can, that's great. And the Land Trust Grants program is very well laid out. Obviously, it's laid out specifically for these kinds of things. And so the funding that we receive for the projects that qualify covers pretty much all expenses. Now, not every project that comes to us or property that comes to us qualifies for their fund. It's pretty specific in which kind of properties that they fund. And so that's then put on us and the landowner to seek other funding. And we do have properties that landowners will choose to fund the conservation easement themselves. So that is a possibility. And then the other options are seeking funding in other locations. So it's a little bit more more work because the funding isn't designed, other funding isn't designed specifically for these projects like the Land Trust Grants program is. So there are options. Why did you decide to go with a small regional land trust versus a larger organization like the Nature Conservancy or Ducks Unlimited? Or did you consider that option?
Yeah, so the I think that you know, as I mentioned initially, I was certainly most aware of the larger organizations, and that was probably the default in terms of what would have happened. My experience was that those large organizations were most interested in extremely large donations, and maybe that was just the ones that I was aware of, and so that's what they put the emphasis on. The other thing that factored in is that through well, a couple of things. Folks that I knew through work had worked for some of the large organizations and weren't always complimentary about the way things were managed and the way the decisions that were made. And a specific example of that was that lands that had been donated to the land trust, a larger land trust organization for conservation purposes, were subsequently sold against the family's wishes in order to fund a project that the larger land trust thought was going to be better. So that was some of the stuff that I had heard. And then in this case, there was a specific personal connection with Jim. I had also met Kim Good through my work, although she doesn't remember that, and was aware that that there was a couple. It's totally true. A couple of really good people.
I remembered just later.
Yeah, whatever. So a couple of really good people working on it, and I guess it comes back to the discussion we had, and Fred's comment is that sometimes a smaller organization can be a little bit more nimble and do things that are specific to the region or to the landscape, where there are, it's not a national standard. It's a little bit local. So, all said, it just kind of came together. It seemed to work. Certainly Legacy understood the particulars of that specific property and my family's objectives.
Great, thank you. Maybe to draw on that a little bit, what was it like working with Legacy?
It was a really positive experience, other than what I've already talked about enough. I, as I said, understood conservation easements and the negotiation process at a really high level. But Kim and Jim and others were kind of prodding me with, well, what about the example that I used of allowing or not allowing the subdivision? What about this? What about that? Forcing me to think through the financial implications, the tax implications. There were fewer legal implications, helping draft the overall management plan. And the management plan, even though I thought I had a fairly good idea, there was a lot of things to think about, and they provided, from our perspective, really valuable guidance. So generally positive. And it's, it may sound like, well, I don't want to leave the impression that I'm totally negative about the experience. There was a really good outcome. There was definitely some hiccups along the way, but it's something that I would recommend that other landowners do if it meets your family's objectives. And there's, it's a multi-generational thing. And I think it can really help. It can help achieve those family objectives. And I also personally think it's really important for just, given what I'm seeing in Western Canada, this region, that these conservation easements are just a critical part of conservation more generally.
Great. I'm just looking at time. Looks like we've got 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then and depending on how fast you answer it, we may get another one, or we'll go straight to let Carrie wrap things up. So you are now sitting on the board for Legacy. Is that something you would recommend to other conservation easements holders? Is it an expectation? Why did you decide to sit on the board? That's more than one question, but maybe you can answer it all together.
Well, I guess first, there's no expectation that a conservation easement holder needs to do anything other than negotiate the conservation easement, or at least that's my understanding. Yeah, so it's like anything else. It's what you want to do. For me, I alluded to this. This in many respects, this has been my job. And so going onto the board just seemed to be logical. I been involved in all kinds of initiatives, and as I just noted, I think at the end of the day, conserving valuable aspects of private land is the best way to get things done. It's better than anything else I've seen. So it's something I wanted to contribute to, and I think I had some technical skills to contribute, and so I was happy to do so. But it's definitely not a requirement.
And we are extremely happy to have you.
Yes.
Yeah, you got it now.
Even when you come in here and complain about stuff. All right.
Does
Does
anybody
one
have?
more?